Hello, today is Friday, February 28th, 2020. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. My LB3 colleague, Deb Boehling, recently published an article about why your information security requires more than just complying with newly enacted privacy laws like California's CCPA. It's a good detailed read, and I do encourage you to check it out on our websites. On today's podcast, Deb and I will highlight what you need to be doing to help protect your company's data, and we'll discuss some of the information security requirements that you are likely to need or that are appropriate for your company. Okay, Deb, you're the lawyer amongst us. What does this all mean for enterprises?
Hey, Joe, it's good to speak with you. What this means for enterprises is, although the protection of personal information is necessary to comply with the CCPA and various state and federal privacy laws, enterprises' needs for information security are far broader. Enterprises must protect the underpinnings of their businesses, their intellectual property, trade secrets, and highly sensitive communications like those related to spin-offs or acquisitions or sales or mergers, and they need to do that against any unauthorized access, use, or disclosure.
So what are enterprises supposed to do?
Enterprises should require their IT and telecoms providers to include appropriate information security clauses in their contracts, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And what's appropriate depends on the size, scope, and the nature of the enterprise, its operational structure, the sensitivity of its information, its regulatory oversight, and what information could be accessed by the providers or through the providers' facilities and systems.
Many of these breaches that we read about, they're actually caused by the companies themselves, or rather the people that work at or with these companies. Is that right?
That's right, Joe. In its 2019 data breach investigation, Verizon determined that 34% of data breaches could be traced to a company's internal actors, such as its employees or contractors. Some of these breaches were intentional and malicious, and they sought personal financial gain or revenge against the company or both. Others were just accidental. They resulted from successful phishing, smishing, and similar campaigns by bad external actors.
Is there something that companies should be doing to prevent this?
There are lots of things companies should be doing, but background checks would be a priority. Background checks can help reduce the risk of internal actor intentional data breaches, and background checks are now the norm for companies that are hiring employees. They include things like social security number traces and criminal background checks. They help your employer profile whether a candidate or employee tends to engage in undesirable behavior that places the enterprise at risk. Your IT and telecoms providers' employees providing your services may also have tendencies that place your enterprise at risk. You need these providers to run the same types of background checks and to agree not to assign and to remove from your account their employees that fail these background checks.
Deb, you and I have to complete cybersecurity training as employees of TC2 and LB3, not only because our clients expect it or some actually require it, but because it's just good security practice.
Absolutely. You and I have been through those, and for those of us that have made mistakes, we've been through it several times. Cybersecurity training reduces the risk of insider actor and accidental data breaches. In fact, the first time I got a failed notice that was actually sent to our IT consultant, I repeated the training and I am extremely careful. It's reasonable to think we now know not to click on links or open PDFs or act on an email or a text that we were not expecting and call to confirm the veracity of the text or the email. That, however, is not the case, particularly when pressure is on. Your providers also need to ensure that their employees are trained, tested, and retrained as necessary. Their employees may cause the same accidental data breaches, and those data breaches may not just affect the service provider information, but they may affect your enterprise's information that is transiting, cached, or hosted on the provider's systems.
I think it's also important to point out that an enterprise's systems and facilities and those of its providers have to be properly configured, protected, and monitored to comply with any security framework. Deb, can you talk about the general security framework that we recommend that our clients adopt?
Sure, Joe. There are various security frameworks, and as I said before, that it depends upon the appropriate framework for your organization. Some of them are relatively simple, and others are very complex. The most widely recognized security frameworks are ISO, or International Services Organization, ISO 27001 and 27002. NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework. CIS, or the Center for Internet Security Framework. COBIT, ISA, ISMA, SOC 2, PCI, and DSS. For more information on those, you can go to the article I presented. Many consider ISO 27002 and CIS V7 to be the best frameworks. As a lawyer, I like SOC 2 because it details how confidential information should be destroyed. As with anything, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Whichever framework you decide fits best, your enterprise needs assurances that its IT and telecoms providers have implemented that framework or something like it to protect your information.
You know, it's really not enough to say that you've implemented one of these frameworks as an enterprise. You do need to periodically assess and audit your compliance. You also need your service providers to do the same, and you need to make sure that they can provide a certificate of compliance.
That's right. You also need to consider how often you need these assurances from your providers. Do you need them annually, biannually, or something else? If your requirements are different than the service provider's requirements and practice, you should expect discussions about this, about the cost and of the additional benefits. Be prepared to negotiate this provision with your service provider.
Now, Deb, I know that there's a long list of security obligations a company will want to include in a service provider contract. Can you talk about just a few?
Sure. Since many cybersecurity frameworks recommend but don't require specific designs, your enterprise may want to specify minimal security obligations your provider must meet. What that means is you get a certificate of compliance with 27001, that ISO 27001. That's got a lot of recommendations but not requirements. By putting it in your contract, the provider is contractually obligated to meet those requirements. And those requirements are often found in a security exhibit to the contract. A few that you probably want to include in those contracts will require the IT or telecoms provider to segregate data on each of its customers and explain how it does that and make sure that you feel comfortable with it. Explain how they encrypt data while it's in transit or at rest and the level of encryption. How they distribute data throughout the world and whether that distribution across country boundaries and regional boundaries is permitted. How the provider prevents and detects intrusions into its systems, and how it protects against viruses and malware. There are a lot more, but we only have so much time on your podcast, Joe.
Thanks, Deb. Now, my philosophy on staying connected is all you need to know in 10 minutes or less. So what are some other contractual provisions that you recommend be included?
In addition to the contractual provisions on background checks, security training of your provider's employees, and provider systems and facility assurances, which are critical, you may also want to require appropriate insurance, including cyber liability insurance. And you will also want to keep in mind whether these new clauses effectively mitigate your information security risks. It depends upon your provider's incentives to comply. You need to check your contract to make sure that those incentives are properly structured. And those incentives are often affected by limitations on liability and exclusions of certain types of damages.
Is there anything else?
There are many, many other things that I could talk about, but here are two that you should prioritize. Managed security. If your enterprise relies on an IT or telecoms provider for managed security solutions, the importance of these information security protections are heightened because you're looking at a third party for that. Do not, however, expect the providers to offer more robust provisions. You will need to demand and fight for those, and including in those areas like limitation of liability and disclaimer of damages. If you're doing hosted, dedicated, and managed CPE, if your enterprise purchases hosted or dedicated and managed CPE, your provider should be more accommodating in meeting your specific information security requirements. If you purchase commodity shared CPE, you may find it difficult to get more than the provider's standard practices. Negotiating the above practices and contract provisions will not be easy. They are often among the most difficult and the last issues to close.
Okay, so with that said, why should companies bother to do it?
In Information security breaches related to a company's intellectual property, trade secrets, and other highly sensitive information have been problems for more than a decade and continue to capture headlines. Your enterprise's competitive position can be severely impacted by a loss of these pieces of information. And an information security breach of a trade secret may deprive your enterprise of protection if appropriate efforts to maintain the trade secret's secrecy are not followed. Investors may also add risk to their analysis of your enterprise if there are these breaches. A breach of secrecy is also likely to include exposure of personal information. Where personal information is exposed, your enterprise's direct and indirect harms and costs, such as regulatory fines, credit monitoring, help desks for folks that have questions about the breach, your security breach analytics, and your improvement in your security requirements to avoid this again, those are enormous, and they are enormous cost items. Seeking appropriate protections from your IT and telecoms providers to take these measures is imperative. Information security is complex and critical, and the breaches create enormous risks. With this handful of clauses in your IT and telecoms provider contracts, you can sleep better. Good luck.
Okay, thanks, Deb. I think you provided what I consider to be some critically important information and guidance. Now, if you'd like to discuss your company's information security, or perhaps you have other ICT needs, contact Deb, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or sending us an email. If you do like these podcasts, you can subscribe to them on Apple, Spotify, and, lots of other platforms. Finally, check out our websites and follow us on LinkedIn to access a lot of useful and timely information.